up, family? Today's topic, reparations, and also examples of the United States of America paying reparations to everyone except us. Let's dive right into it.
Welcome back. We want to dive in deeper. As we saw earlier, reparations is a hugely divisive issue. A Pew Research poll taken in late 2021 found that by a more than 2-to-1 margin, Americans oppose reparations for African Americans. And look at the racial split. Whites overwhelmingly oppose reparations, 80%. But the numbers are almost exactly reversed among African Americans who strongly support the idea. So joining me now is Cornell William Brooks. He's a professor of the practice of public leadership and social justice at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's also a former president and CEO of the NAACP. And Coleman Hughes is a columnist and host of the Society and Culture podcast, Conversations with Coleman. Both of you have agreed to essentially lightly debate this issue with me as playing my role of moderator here. So, Cornell Brooks, let me start with you. You've been studying this for quite some time, and you've been working with some religious leaders to come up, I think it's fair to say, a modern blueprint of what you think. What would reparations look like in the 21st century? Make the case.
That's right. So I've had the pleasure and honor of working with both the National Council of Churches and the Union of Reform Judaism and a group of Harvard Kennedy School students who are working with these large religious associations all across the country, representing over 40 million people, to create a moral discourse on reparations. Why? Because we know that in many corners of our republic, it's being politically weaponized. And they're endeavoring to make, I'd say, 3 key points here. The first of which is, with respect to reparations, you often hear that the harm was too long ago, it's too expensive, and too impossible, too difficult to do. What we find is the harm was not long ago, right? So in other words, yes, slavery ended in 1863 and 1865, but the convict leasing system, representing 1 million people enslaved, lasted up until the opening days of World War II, right? And all of these systems of oppression continue into the present, point one. Point two, with respect to reparations being too difficult. I want to know something here, Chuck, that's critically important. My colleague, Linda Bilmes, who's a public economist at the Harvard Kennedy School, we've done a study, and we looked at all of these programs across the federal government, and we make the case that we're already doing reparations. We simply don't call it that. So in other words, there's a norm in government which essentially says, if an American has been harmed through no fault of their own, the government will often step in to try to make them whole. We do this not only with respect to Japanese Americans who were interned after World War II, but we also do it with respect to veterans, with respect to people who suffered in a natural disaster. We do it with respect to children who've been harmed by vaccines. We do it with respect to pensions that are insured. So we do this over and over again, which says that we can do it. And lastly, we do it at the level of millions, billions, even trillions of dollars. So we can't afford to do it.
All right, Coleman Hughes, let me bring you in here. You testified before Congress in 2019 against the idea of reparations. You said paying reparations to descendants of slavery would, quote, only divide the country further. And you thought it would insult black Americans by putting a price on the suffering as well, and would make black Americans like yourself victims without their consent. I hope I captured that correctly, but you take it further. Make your case against.
So let me just make a distinction off the bat. I support reparations for redlining, right? Because there are many victims of redlining that are still with us. They're still alive. And Cornell, all the examples of successful reparations for other groups that you highlighted were examples of reparations given to directly the victims of these human rights abuses in their lifetimes or their immediate family members. That's why I support reparations for redlining paid directly to the victims, as they're doing in Evanston outside of Chicago. I make a distinction between that and reparations for slavery, which ended in 1865. I know of no examples where groups are getting reparations for historical crimes that are over 150 years old. And unfortunately, the opportunity was tragically missed to pay it to the slaves themselves or their immediate families.
Now, to me, slavery is equivalent to murder and rape, because that's exactly what was going on. Violations of human rights, etc., etc., right? Hit me in the comment box and let me know what you think. But my point is, come on now. I mean, this guy is insane. Go ahead and pay the money out and give a stipulation of we must spend it in America. We can't spend it no place else. The money's going to go right back to the system. And if you want to talk about inflation, pay it out over a 10-year period so it doesn't really hit hard. You feel me? But this needs to be taken care of. And this guy's out of his mind talking about the time has run out. So, I mean, it's been however many years and they didn't want to pay. So just because they don't want to pay, I mean, 1,500 years from now, you know what I'm saying? If they don't want to pay, they don't want to pay. It is what it is. But there shouldn't be a time limit or a statute of limitations.
But claims like this time out, right? And this is timed out. And let me say one more thing. Martin Luther King had a plan for addressing the legacy of slavery, which he laid out in his book, Why We Can't Wait. And he called it the Bill of Rights for the Disadvantaged. The Bill of Rights for the Disadvantaged was not a race-based policy. It was a class-based anti-poverty program that would benefit the black poor and the white poor and the poor of all races. That's what I support in terms of addressing the legacy of slavery. That's what I feel is the wisest path forward for this country.
How? There were no white slaves in America out picking cotton, getting hung on trees, getting lash after lash on the back. You know what I'm saying? Man, get the fuck out of here. I'm talking shit. This dude is a clown.
Let me follow up a little bit, Coleman, because it is interesting that there are some forms of specific areas where you believe a reparation of sorts should be put there. How do you distinguish Jim Crow? And what is the right amount of time? And I say that Germany is still paying reparations to now descendants of Holocaust victims. So what is the timeline where you feel like where you would draw the line?
So I think reasonable people can disagree on this, and I don't claim to have the last word on the subject, but I think we can all agree reparations should be paid ideally in the lifetime of the victim. If the victim dies, it should be paid to their spouse or to their children. Once you get to grandchildren and beyond, my personal view is that that's beyond my line.
So his suggestion is the United States of America should get away with slavery, murder, rape. I mean, this dude. So who's supposed to get the money? Now I'll say beneficiaries, I don't care how far the line, how far down the line. If you are a descendant of a slave, you should get paid. You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, this is crazy. I don't know who paid this guy to say this bullshit.
But like I said, reasonable people can disagree on this, but there's no doubt that, in my view, crimes from the 1850s and 60s are beyond the statute of limitations.
Do you see this where services can sort of be what is reparations? So maybe it is free college, maybe it's discounted college, maybe it is tax breaks, however you want to describe it. Is that an acceptable form in your opinion?
It is an acceptable form. And when we look at what we call reparatory compensation programs in government, they use a variety of strategies to help make people whole. But let's go to this point about indirect victims. When we look at the policies, when we look at government, when we look at history, we actually do compensate people who have suffered a harm indirectly and their heirs. Think about this. So in Tulsa, Oklahoma, right, Black Wall Street was bombed from the air. Homes were burned on the ground. No compensation, including for victims who are over 100 years old today. But when we bombed islands in the South Pacific, as in the U.S. government, we paid compensation to direct victims, indirect victims, and their heirs as a consequence of an American government bombing people on the ground. The point being here is when you look at reparatory compensation programs, what you find is there are a variety of direct and indirect victims who are compensated for nearly every group but black people.
I want to play a clip from Ronald Reagan after he signed a bill to repay Japanese Americans who were detained during World War II. Here's what he said in August of 1988.
Yet no payment can make up for those lost years. So what is most important in this bill has less to do with property than with honor. For here we admit a wrong. Here we reaffirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law.
Coleman, is that a model for how America should deal with this? Could it be a model for how we dealt with Japanese Americans?
Like I said, the opportunity was missed in the lifetimes of slaves. I know of 0 examples of a group, an ethnic group, getting reparations 150 years after the crime in question. Now, when it comes to honor and symbolic apologies, I completely support those. I'd also like to point out many have been made, and almost none have been really accepted by the spokespeople for Black Americans. So, for example, both houses of Congress officially apologized for slavery and Jim Crow in 2008 and 2009. The Senate officially apologized for lynching in 2004. Slavery is, of course, a state's issue, as you know, and at least 8 different southern states have issued official apologies for slavery. We have a beautiful museum in the nation's capital, which opened with an extensive exhibit on slavery in the Middle Passage, which...
Is this guy a comedian? Talking about an apology for lynching and an apology for this, apology of that, for that, museums. Man, I want some land. I want half land. I need my land to have all the utilities on it already. And I need half cash. Are you kidding me? Man, let's give this guy 2 slaps, man. He's out of his goddamn mind.
Was overflowing with patrons when it opened. I think we have made many gestures and symbolic gestures to give that sort of honor that Reagan was talking about.
Hey, Cornell and Coleman, you guys were terrific, very polite debate on something that can be very divisive in our society, but that was the whole point of why we invited you guys here.
Symbolic gestures don't pay the bills. It doesn't help out poverty-stricken neighborhoods. Yeah, he's a clown. Anyways, let's get to the examples of the United States paying reparations to everybody except us. It's insane. Check it.
In 2014, writer Ta-Nehisi Coates' article for The Atlantic, The Case for Reparations, went viral, tracing everything from the racial terror of slavery to the rampant housing discrimination of the 20th century. Coates made the case for financial reparations for the descendants of those who were enslaved in the US. However, the argument for reparations extends back much further than 2014 and also has significance beyond the Black American community. So today we're talking about one of the most controversial topics moving through American politics for over 150 years, and we're going to explore a few key things. First, we'll look at examples of reparations that have been made to other communities across the globe. Next, we'll trace the history of the arguments for and against reparations to Black Americans. And finally, we'll discuss where the arguments around reparations stand in the US today. Articles like Coates' often focus solely on the history and arguments for reparations for Black Americans who are the descendants of slaves because of historic harm inflicted on that community by the US government. But there's actually a much larger conversation to be had. Before we dive into the then and now of reparations debates, we should first look at the global and historical precedents. So let's start with 2 examples from the US. Japanese American survivors of the internment/concentration camps of World War II and Native Americans. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988, spearheaded by people like Congressman Norman Mineta, who was himself a survivor of Japanese American internment, was a watershed moment for this community. The bill, which was followed by a formal ceremony for survivors in 1990, issued checks for $20,000 and a letter of apology to over 80,000 people after 120,000 were forced into American camps during World War II. And you can learn more about the history of concentration camps in our video, Concentration Camps Are Older Than World War II, right here on our channel. There were also earlier reparations paid to Native American communities. The Indian Claims Commission was created by Congress in 1946 and lasted until 1978. The commission was led by commissioners appointed by the president, and tribes and nations were given 5-year spans to file complaints. The commission could only make monetary awards since the return of land was explicitly excluded. Over the course of its history, approximately $1.3 billion was awarded to 176 tribes and nations. According to Aaron Blakemore at History.com, this amounted to approximately $1,000 per person of Native ancestry, and much of the money was kept in trust or earmarked for reservation projects. But we should note that the commission has also been accused of chronic mismanagement. A separate agreement was made with Congress in 1971 when $962 million worth of Alaskan land, about 44 million acres, was awarded to Native groups in exchange for them giving up claims to land in the rest of the state. But again, the money was not given directly. Regional and village corporations were placed in charge of the land, and beneficiaries were given shares of stock in those corporations. Although these aren't the only examples of the US paying reparations, they do establish a pattern. When historic harm has occurred, the US government has been prepared to make amends, either through legislation or financial payments or both. Now let's look internationally. Two of the best-known cases of government reparations occurred in Germany after World War II and South Africa after the end of apartheid. First, Germany. In the wake of World War II and the systematic genocide of approximately 6 million Jewish people, the German government, as well as many German banks and financial institutions, paid billions of dollars to Israel and to individual survivors over the course of decades. The German reparations program was created in 1952, when the first Chancellor of West Germany, Konrad Adenauer, signed the Luxembourg Agreement with Israel. And as of its 60th anniversary in 2012, the agreement had seen Germany pay out approximately $89 billion. The requirements and payouts have varied as the generations who lived during the war have aged and died. For example, in 2011, the requirement for receiving compensation as a survivor of a ghetto was reduced from 18 months spent living there to 12 months. And in 2012, the program was open to survivors who lived under Soviet rule countries, making approximately 80,000 people eligible for payments of $3,250. Now let's turn our attention to reparations made in South Africa. In this case, the reparations came more in the form of truth-telling and public hearings rather than direct financial payments. In 1994, after Nelson Mandela was elected president after the country's first democratic and free elections, the country looked for ways to heal the harm caused by previous regimes. Under South Africa's apartheid government, there had been years of racialized violence against the Black population. Laws banning interracial marriage and requiring Black citizens to live in under-resourced communities and carry identification documents were just some of the violence committed under apartheid. But the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, also known as the TRC, set up nationally televised hearings where Black South Africans were able to publicly name the indignities they had been forced to suffer over decades. Although many of the perpetrators showed little remorse, the TRC started in 1995 with testimony from 21,000 survivors, 2,000 public hearings, and 7,112 amnesty applications that shed light on the government's systematic abuses. The TRC shone a national and international spotlight on the human rights abuses of the apartheid era. However, the financial reparations promised through the TRC were extremely limited. In 2003, President Thabo Mbeki announced that one-time payments of around $4,000 each would be made to 18,000 survivors of apartheid who testified before the TRC, and the rest of the money would be placed into development programs for all South Africans. Through these examples, we can see that reparations can take many forms. It can be through direct payments, apologies made, community investments, or truth told. But what these disparate examples demonstrate is that reparations for past harm are a possibility and have been historically throughout the 20th century. So what about that old contentious argument about reparations for the US's involvement in slavery? It's an argument that stretches back to the end of the Civil War and continues to this day. If you've heard anything about the argument for reparations being made to Black Americans, then you've probably heard the phrase 40 acres and a mule. But where does this oft-quoted phrase and the idea behind it come from? Although it's come to stand for the promises made and broken to the formerly enslaved immediately following the abolition of slavery and the end of the Civil War, this history is also a little more complicated than that. General William T. Sherman's Special Field Order Number 15 is the original source of this historical nugget, although the mule wasn't actually included in the text of the order. According to an article by historian Henry Louis Gates Jr., the order was an important post-war decision for a few key reasons. Issued on January 16, 1865, it came after Sherman, a Union general, and Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton met with 20 black community leaders in Savannah, Georgia 4 days earlier. The leader suggested that what newly minted black citizens wanted most was land. One of the leaders, Reverend Garrison Frazier, is quoted as saying, "The way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land and turn it and till it by our own labor, and we can soon maintain ourselves and have something to spare. We want to be placed on land until we are able to buy it and make it our own." When asked, all but one member of the group of community leaders agreed that black people should form self-run communities in order to avoid the prejudice of the South.
Sounds good to me. Self-run communities. You feel me? So yeah, we need to go off the grid, get some neighborhoods, whole neighborhoods that's off the grid, and become self-sustainable, no doubt.
In addition to listening to these suggestions, Stanton and Sherman had their own reasons for allocating land to newly freed black people. First, they were looking for ways to weaken the morale and financial stronghold of Southern Confederate landowners. And second, they sought a solution for how to provide for the millions of newly emancipated black people who had either followed the Union into battle or been set free by the Emancipation Proclamation. The actual text of Sherman's field order is broken into 7 parts with 3 key takeaways. Section 1 notes that these highlighted lands were to be set aside for newly freed black people. Section 2 notes that the settlements would be governed and run by black people. And Section 3 allocated plots of up to 40 acres out of the 400,000 acres seized and set them aside for this purpose. Sherman later ordered that the army could lend a mule to the new settlers, hence the second part of this famous phrase. Although Special Field Order 15 was quickly approved by President Lincoln, it was also short-lived. President Andrew Johnson, who followed Lincoln, was a sympathizer of the South and overturned the order the same year it was issued, returning the land to the plantation owners who had originally possessed it. But the phrase 40 acres and a mule would continue to be a rallying cry for the forgotten promises of the Reconstruction period, as well as a symbol of the hope of justice for descendants of the enslaved. Sherman's Special Field Order Number 15 wasn't the last time that reparations would be paid to members of the black community. In fact, there are several instances of particular members of the black community receiving reparations and amends from state governments and the federal government for individual instances of abuse. Take, for example, the survivors and descendants of the Tuskegee syphilis study, which took place from 1932 to 1972. During these years, researchers and doctors told poor black men who signed up for the study that they were receiving treatment for syphilis, when instead they were getting vitamins and placebos, leaving the disease to spread unchecked. Over time, the men got sicker and spread the disease to their partners and even their children at birth. You can learn more about the lasting impacts of this study in our video, Health Disparities in the Black Community, Past and Present. The Associated Press's Gene Heller broke the story in 1972, and after public backlash, the study shut down. In response to the revelations, the survivors received an out-of-court settlement of $10 million. The U.S. also promised healthcare and burial services to the men affected, and later provided healthcare and other services to their spouses and descendants. In 1997, President Clinton issued an apology for the government's role in the cruel experiment. The city of Chicago also paid reparations to victims of former police commander John Burge. For almost 20 years, from the 1970s to the 1990s, Burge led a crew of officers who tortured mostly black men into giving confessions for crimes they did not commit. Over 125 men were tortured by Burge and his affiliates, and in 2015 the city approved reparations for the survivors of these crimes.
Okay, so it sounds like to me, even if you aren't a descendant of a slave, and you've just been experiencing systemic racism, police brutality. I mean, I hate to admit it, I've been traumatized by the police in America myself. You know what I'm saying? So if they paid reparations for mistreatment or violating human rights or whatever part of the Constitution. You know what I'm saying? It's like we all should get paid. We all should get reparations. You know, and like I said, the money doesn't leave the system. You know, put a stipulation in there like you must spend the money in America and no place else, and we're gonna give it right back. But my thing is, don't fuck it off. Don't end up with nothing. Be smart. Grab you some assets to offset your liabilities. Don't just blow your money on Cadillac Escalades, jewelry, sticks, bricks, pounds. You know what I'm saying? Get you some land with a farm on it. Get you some water rights and self-sustain. You feel me?
The $5.5 million settlement included money paid to the survivors and their families, waived tuition to city colleges, a mandatory Chicago public schools curriculum about Burgess crimes, and a public memorial, which as of the creation of this video is yet to be built. So where does that leave us in regards to the arguments for reparations for descendants of the enslaved? Many detractors of the argument point to the fact that no one alive today was personally or financially responsible for the crimes committed prior to emancipation. And yet, as is the case with reparations paid to Native Americans and descendants of the victims in some of the examples I shared, reparations for past harm can and have been paid after all of those involved in the original act have passed away. People who are in favor of reparations, such as Coates, argue that the historic disparities that have existed within the Black community in the US, such as the wealth gap, housing disparities, and health disparities, are a direct result of the economic and social legacies of slavery. In her article, Reparations History and the Origins of Global Justice, Professor Katrina Forrester notes the long history throughout the 20th and 21st century of the fight for slavery reparations in the Black community. And even within groups that advocated or continue to advocate for reparations, there's still tons of disagreement. Forster writes, American proponents of reparations for slavery disagree over what they would look like. Pecuniary or non-pecuniary, one-off cash transfers to individuals as in South Africa, or compensation in the form of transfers or pensions like German reparations to Jewish victims of Nazism. Public investment, group-specific banks, trusts, or funds, the return of land, job guarantees for Black workers. There are disagreements over what reparations are for and how they should be calculated, whether they should compensate unpaid slave labor, unjust enrichment of slaveholders, wrongs suffered in the Jim Crow South, or wrongs suffered because of institutional racism in home buying, segregated education, and so on in the North. Forster's argument brings up a great point. Although there has been persistent agitation for reparations for decades, people rarely agree on what the outcome would look like. But I would argue that's in large part because there have been many models of reparations made throughout the 20th century, rather than a lack of imagination about what can be done to repair historic harm caused by the government. So where does that leave us now? Well, in 2019, the House of Representatives considered starting a commission on reparations for slavery, and in that same year, they held a hearing in which experts, including journalists like Coates, were asked to testify. And although no reparations for slavery have been made since, there's still ongoing activism and interest in seeing the conversation moved forward. But regardless of where you fall in this particular instance of reparations, the fact remains that there are historical and legal precedents for this type of action being paid to certain communities over time. Perhaps in the future we'll see the US tackle its own history with slavery through financial payments, greater educational understandings of the legacies of slavery, or some other method. But until some resolution can be reached, the debate rages on.
Check it, folks. I'm going to continue to update you on the progress of reparations, and not just from slavery, from all this abuse for the past, even after slavery, redlining, you know what I'm saying, systemic racism, on down the line, you know. But I feel we really have to unite to get this done, from the east to the west, the south to the north. Y'all do me a favor and hit that like button, subscribe, and that notification bell. It's your boy. I'm out.